All right. So, welcome everyone this evening, whether you're coming to us in the live session or whether you're watching this after. I am Mike Strode. I am currently the secretary of the Dill Pickle Food Cooperative and owner number 3370. And we are here tonight for the Q&A chat of the Co-op Wars. Tonight, we're going to be having a wonderful discussion between a few members of the film team. We've got Erik Esse, we've got Deacon Warner, we've got Stacey Sutton, and we've got Dan Arnett of Chicago Market. So I'm going to, go ahead and just frame a little bit, what we wanted to touch upon this evening, a little bit of the themes for this evening, and then we will get into some intros from our guest, or at least, a little bit more than what is available in our bios. So first of all, just talking about the theme that we wanted to touch upon this evening, we're looking at how the relationship dynamics of that were covered in the Co-op Wars relate to the co-op movement that we are a part of today here in Chicago, or in Chicagoland more broadly, since we do have cooperators from across the Chicagoland area, and how we can make sure that we are being effective in working in solidarity with this broader cooperative movement and with one another as cooperators. So with that said, our panelists this evening will include Stacey Sutton, an associate professor in Department of Urban Planning and Policy, who is a researcher on economic democracy, worker-owned cooperatives, and solidarity economy ecosystems. We've got Deacon Warner, a director of the Co-op Wars, but also other films such as 56 and Peaceful Warriors, Be Sharp Honeybee, and many short documentaries, and an award-winning director. So we're glad to have you this evening. Erik Esse is the producer of the Co-op Wars. Erik Esse. Thank you for that correction. I appreciate that. Who's worked in film and television marketing and distribution at IFP Minnesota, as well as the independent television service. And there's an interesting connection on our panel tonight between Dan Arnett, because they both had passing at Central Co-op in Seattle. And then there is, we've got Dan Arnett, who is going to be the newest GM of the Chicago market, the newest cooperator on the scene here in the Chicago region, veteran of the grocery cooperative business, holding various roles, Good Foods Co-op in Lexington, Kentucky, Central Co-op, previously mentioned, Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op. And Dan is, I want to say, recently an award-winning cooperator. So, that's certainly something to note, and also holds a Master of Management from the Cooperatives and Credit Union, St. Mary's University, where a bunch of cooperators go to kind of put the feather in their cap. So we really appreciate the panel this evening. As I mentioned, I am the secretary of the Dill Pickle Food Cooperative, also founding coordinator of the Cola Nut Collaborative, which has helped to put together the panel this evening, as well as the screening. But this panel was also put together by a host of cooperatives. So I want to, shout out those cooperatives. We already have heard about the Dill Pickle Food Cooperative, but we've got Sugar Beet, we've got Common Ground, Chicago Market, Southside Food, Prairie Food. So a host of cooperators have come together, have cooperated to bring you the conversation that we're going to be having this evening. And with that, we are off to our discussion. So I want to hand it over to Erik and Deacon to just give us a little bit of background on what brought you together to cover this film. What was the sort of motivation that came forward to bring this film to bring?
Sure. Back in 2006, I think. Yeah, 2006. I worked at North Country Co-op in Minneapolis, which is the oldest natural foods co-op there, and I was in marketing there. And so I was in charge of their 35th anniversary events. And through doing panels about that, I found out about the Co-op Wars as an event and thought this was super fascinating, and had a lot of interesting issues involved. And so that was in the back of my mind. And later on, I ended up working at IFP in the independent film world, and with Deacon, and mentioned this as a potential idea for a documentary. And many years later, we've actually created it. So Deacon, you can add to that.
Yeah, I was not aware of the co-op wars until Eric made me aware of it, and then I read a book by Craig Cox, who's kind of our expert subject in the film, and learned about that. I was at the time working with and involved with another subject in the film, Annie Young, who was working to start a co-op in North Minneapolis here, the Worth Co-op, that was initially part of our story in telling the film. We wanted to be following contemporary co-ops and kind of following that story in comparison to what happened back then. That co-op didn't succeed, and the reasons for it were too complex and not connected to the story, so it's not in the film. But that was that was my connection to the co-op world, and was fascinated by the story. And as we got to meet the individuals involved, just more and more fascinated with the complexities of it and what we can learn from it.
Thank you very much. And so I want to drop into really the first framing question that's really key to this discussion, and offer also the opportunity for Dan and Stacey to share their background and their relationship to this film, or what they drew from the film. But one of the framing questions that we wanted to drop into very early on is just, the backdrop to this film is the 1970s. We are, some 50 years out from that particular moment of this co-op wars, but there are similar tensions. There are some themes that are explored in the film. And so how do each of you, see the themes or the tensions that are explored within the co-op wars being relevant or showing up in 2021, and how they relate to what cooperators can be engaging in or doing today, in terms of the social justice battles that are on engaged today, for the landscape rather. Thank you. So I'll pitch that first to Dan and Stacey, and then we'll shift back to Eric and Deacon.
You want to go first, Stacey? Or you want me
to Dan and Stacey, so I'll follow you, Dan.
All right. Fair enough. We'll save the best for last then. So, there are some obvious parallels that everybody's going to get. I mean, we're coming off of unpopular war that's, obviously not ended the way we wanted. If there was any way it could end that anybody wanted, frankly. You have this period of economic uncertainty. You've got a focus on inequity and injustice in society. It was similar. I think there's a lot of distrust in general of institutions that in some areas people would just trust, on just, I wouldn't say blindly, that may not be a fair word, but certainly we're in a period of distrust of institutions. So, there's a lot of those macro level things that really do have parallels. But I do think there are significant differences as well. I mean, we have a food co-op movement that is far more sophisticated, and that's in place now. It's not sort of a genesis of a different take on food co-ops that the second wave natural foods really were. Now we've got many robust examples. We have a very robust natural food system. I mean, even if it's not our favorite, there's folks like Whole Foods, there's access to minimally processed foods, there's more awareness of fair trade and local issues. But we also have globalization and intense consolidation to deal with. And I think that those are very distinctive food issues now that weren't really as the same kind of issues then. But certainly I think just that sense that there's something needs to change, that there's a dissatisfaction and there's an unraveling of cultural cohesiveness, and for good reason. I think we're at a stage that an inflection point. But I think, there's a similar dissatisfaction, I think, is probably the biggest theme. And also the flip side of that is I think we're starting to see more innovation percolate. And that was a period of intense creativity. It wasn't just the arts, also in things like the food co-ops. And I think we're we have a hopefulness that I think they had then, even in a moment of despair. So that's kind of how I connect the two periods.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add. I think that was well put in terms of some of the similarities and differences. I was struck in watching it in that the ideological differences and the starkness in terms of those the tensions that were highlighted. Whereas I may sound cynical, but I think it may not be as stark currently. And I'm not in the food co-op movement in the same way as many of you, but I have a long history in food co-ops, growing up in New York, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and at the time it was pretty much 95% Black. My family was a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op, kind of on and off, which is one of the older food co-ops, and then as an adult, I was a full member, regularly working and so forth. So I say that to say that there were very clear racial tensions that were palpable, and that were silenced, though, often in those spaces. And then later, when I was doing my research, I happened to focus on Black-owned businesses in Brooklyn. That was the subject of my dissertation, not co-ops, but I was very much active in trying to start the Central Brooklyn food co-op, and there was a Fort Greene food co-op. We're trying to start that. But I say all that to say, because the film highlighted things that I hope we can talk about, that it didn't seem like there was space for those conversations, where one thing today, I think in being more sophisticated, we've actually created space for dialogue and for disagreement, and to just name the challenges, right? To name the disparate resources in Black, brown, and white neighborhoods. And so I think that's extremely important. That pushes us down the trajectory of possibility. I also think, and this might sound a little cliched, everyone, but that taking that sixth principle very seriously, in terms of that's how I understand this formation today. And even some of the work that I have my students do, I teach a course in solidarity economy graduate program, urban planning and policy. And one of the early years that I did that, I helped write the students wrote a feasibility study for, at the time, it was Austin Coming Together. They were trying to do their food co-op. I was blown away by all of the support from Dill Pickle, from, I forget all the others. I didn't need to call them. But all the co-ops, the ones that were in Oak Park and others, that would just share their information, openly share information, so that we get the feasibility correct. So I say that to say that I see far more possibility than the film revealed or spoke to. And I don't think the radical edge is different. So I do think there is a radical edge currently, but the radical edge may be a little bit smoother today. But I do think the ideological differences, I don't think it's always as racialized, but the ideological differences are something that we definitely should be talking about, right? How much of the work is about a politic as well as just access to good food, right? So I'll just end there and let others.
Sure. Well, something that pops into my mind is that it's also another time of generational tension. You got the boomers in the 60s saying don't trust anyone over 30, and now you got okay boomer at the boomers. But that's somewhat a social media creation to some extent, I think, maybe, and especially I think it's, you guys tell me, but my experience with co-ops now and startup co-ops is they're very multi-generational. And there's not that idea that, this sort of anti-expertise, we have nothing to learn from previous models that some of the 70s co-ops had. And then there's, luckily, of course, this, as Dan mentioned, this robust model for how to create a co-op. So that's great that people are more open to the expertise, and the expertise is there. Another thing that sort of runs counter to that is that back in the 70s, it was a time of change in the food industry where the mom and pop grocery store was dying or dead and the supermarket was taking over. And now, especially because of COVID, we have a transition from supermarkets to online or the new Amazon model of stores. And it's creating a lot of uncertainty. So this robust model that the food co-ops have been creating for the last 50 years is now a little bit in question because we don't know where things are going. So yeah, so that's an interesting parallel in that, like, things are up in the air, and we don't know what we're going to look like in 20, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, and I guess I would add on to what Stacey was talking about is the idea that there is still this radical edge, but giving that, it's not quite the same. That era of revolution that was happening in the late 70s, 60s, and 70s, these people were schooled in things like Maoism, and in some ways, I think that was maybe a disadvantage, that sort of heightening the contradictions. That's how people came into this movement, was like, I need to do, this is revolutionary, I need to see through my vision, and at all costs. And I think that there's a little bit more of a realism in the movement now, that we do need to kind of have somewhat of a larger tent beyond just what our exact ideologies are. Yeah.
Those are all very beautiful landing points, and just being someone who is a bundle of those contradictions. I very much like to walk into cooperative spaces and name that I am an anti-capitalist who is sitting on the board of a $6 million co-op. I'll name that, right? And there's certainly ways that I wrestle with the notions of what the co-op is supposed to do, and what, like, my legal and fiduciary responsibility as a board member is for what the co-op can do, right? And so those are wonderful tensions to hold, and that's the world we live in, a bundle of tension.
Yeah. And there was an idea that with the old ones that this was a way to escape any contact with the straight world, the capitalist world, whatever. And I don't think anyone thinks that that's necessarily a realistic thing at this point.
I also think a big difference between then and now is just an understanding of what cooperatives mean and what the system is, and that it's not a nonprofit system. It's democratic ownership, and the co-opers back then stumbled into it without really knowing what they were doing until they had to figure it out. But we've got those lessons, and we've got that generation that hopefully is still engaged in forming new co-ops as they start up, so we're not kind of making some of the same mistakes. But it's changed so much. When Annie Young, the person that I was working with to start a North Minneapolis co-op, talked a lot about how, back in the day, we just did it in a weekend, that mom and pop store was open, we moved stuff in, and we just did it and started. And maybe not knowing too much kind of kept them from being inhibited. Now it's a much slower process, because the expectations are higher to open a store that, will draw people in. What we expect from a store is different. Something that's a challenge today, I think.
But I wonder if I can just kind of raise a question. I don't have the answer, and I'm raising for the other panelists as well, in the sense of, how you see the cooperative movement dealing with the contradictions, right? Dealing with the, even if it doesn't show up in with a hard edge, there's definitely folks that are anti-capitalists, and at the same time they're operating within this enterprise that is a for-profit. And by and large, that's the contradiction. But there are other models of food co-ops, like a Mandela food co-op, which is a hybrid model. So you can have worker owners at the same time that you have member owners, and trying to get at a more equitable distribution of resources. And while, as we say, as we often say, you can't co-opt your way out of capitalism, you surely can not create co-ops that are not just trying to just exacerbate the ills of capitalism. So I just wonder where you see, that the various model, like how granted, we're in this moment of advanced capitalism, so they have to compete. But competing on the terms of private enterprise, and competing with a different model in terms of which the communities in which they're embedded, right? They offer, some of the co-ops that I visit outside of Chicago, they're offering a range of services as well, right? So it's because they're responding to community needs, and I imagine the margins are thin, so there's no co-op can make that much, or no supermarket. For better or worse, but I just leave it there. I'll stop, because I can just keep talking in circles, and Mike knows that I can go on and on. But the point being, how, I'm really struggling with this notion of, like, just a kinder, gentler capitalism in the co-op as opposed to something else. So I'll leave it there.
and I'll allow sort of that question to permeate your minds, and I'll just invite this question in from the chat, even though I know there are three framing questions that I also sent you all. But in the chat, Olivia noted, isn't there some benefit to drawing people into radical thinking via co-ops? If we keep them apolitical, what are we losing? So that's a question from the chat, and certainly if you want to kind of wrestle with that question or respond to Stacey's inquiry, I'll offer space to do that.
Well, something that question makes me think of is actually sort of reversing the question, is that's drawing people into radical thinking via co-ops, and because there's drawing people in the who already have radical thinking and then drawing them into co-ops. And I think in the 90s, when there was this big mainstreaming of natural foods, there was a definite urge amongst co-ops to de-emphasize the political and sort of the hippie roots, because it was seen as very niche and alienating. And you can see out of something like the co-op wars, that was pretty alienating to people as well. And some of the criticisms of the CO had at co-ops about how much they were sort of hippie clubhouses as opposed to community-based organizations were correct. And so you had co-ops not using the word co-op, using the word market, and like that, doing stuff like that. And I think right now we're in a situation where the natural food product line is available at Whole Foods and big corporate stores often. And so there's no differentiation there that there was in the 90s. But what there is a differentiation is the social change aspect and the cooperative model. And so there's actually reason to think as a marketer to start talking about co-ops more. I mean, I'm in Seattle here where REI is based, and they suddenly stuck co-op back in their name. I think that because it set them apart from other organizations. So that's sort of the cynical side of why they emphasize cooperatives. But I think it does draw people in, and then it has to be authentic too. That has to be like, you can emphasize how buying various products is good for the world in various ways. But I think there's an opportunity for some sort of activism to be done by co-ops to get the members involved in stuff beyond purchasing product, but in a way that's creates consensus amongst the members, not division, like the CO did. And I think that would be, it's not done that much, and I think it's a huge opportunity and sort of necessary to justify why having a co-op as opposed to corporate stores. And I know it's really hard because some people grew up inside the co-op movement, so that's all they know, but other people are coming from other parts of the food system, and they know how to run a grocery store. They're not politicians, they're not ideologues, and when I've tried to introduce talking about farm worker issues, for instance, in some co-ops, they were very resistant because they didn't want anything negative in their newsletter, anything that's controversial. And I understand that. I don't want to piss people off and make them not like the store, but if we don't have some sort of social aspect, both that the store is talking about and that the members can be involved in, I think we're just going to be outcompeted by the corporate stores.
And I would add to that part of that was agreed upon by both sides back in the co-op war was the community-based nature of co-ops, which is beyond just the model of co-ops. But the importance of that today, I think, is more important than ever when we're sort of in a situation where we want to rebuild our communities. We want our communities to know each other. And the project I'm working on now is looking at public safety and how we can change our models to get back to the importance of that, of looking out for each other, of mutual protection. When the atmosphere of a co-op, when we go in, it is a sharing of ideas. Even today, there's everyone I know here at least has poster boards and things that you don't see at Whole Foods or anywhere else. And I think that's vital. It's maybe not as revolutionary as some are seeking, but it's vital, I think.
I'm going to actually tee up Dan. You were at Central when it was switched to a hybrid model. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure. Well, that was a little thing I cooked up because it fit the style of that co-op. It just didn't know it yet. But the reasoning for that whole thing when we split to go 50% worker, 50% consumer, which I think we passed it with like 96.5% of owners voting in favor in the largest turnout we'd ever had. So I thought that was a pretty good democratic action, not just something I pushed on anybody. It was a good idea. The whole reasoning behind that, I think, is the more critical piece, that the co-ops have this dual character. They're association and an enterprise. And sometimes I think there's this sense that we have to, well, let's do some associational stuff, or we've got to do these nice social activities, but we also run the store. And those are not separate activities if a co-op is really going to be stable and vibrant over a long term. I think, as opposed to seeing that as two separate streams of activity, the real way you want to strategize this to remain competitive and relevant is to think of it as a synthesis. There's a space where both of those ideas can be satisfied at once. And I think that's a proper space for a cooperative to operate. So sometimes there's a really worthy endeavor, but it may not be that the co-op is the proper vehicle for it. And sometimes that confusion, or getting outside of what our core competencies and abilities are as the kind of institution we are, is where we get into trouble. So if we really always focus on things that satisfy our entrepreneurial and associational character, it's very hard to go wrong. If we just say, well, we've just got to compete with this Whole Foods, inevitably we will make decisions that pull us away from a very reason for existing in the first place, and we will always lose playing someone else's game. It's sort of like if you're Michael Jordan and you went off to say, I'm retiring from basketball and I'm going to be a great baseball star, and that didn't work out so well. He came back to basketball and he was great again. There's a space where we can be really great and effective, and it's not by mimicking Whole Foods. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is that there's not a space where we just are purely competing with these other places, just like you said. But it's also true that we can't chase every cause through this institution. We're not a panacea. We're not the solution to every problem. That's something that has to be recognized too. So really knowing yourself, knowing what you can be effective at, filtering that through your democracy, that gets you somewhere meaningful. And that's how we came up with the solidarity model for Central. It fit the way that we forecast how the market was going to evolve. It fit the values and principles of that system, and we deployed it effectively. And of course, it's successful. But I think that's the litmus test. Are you feeding both of those pieces of your twin character simultaneously? Because if not, that's a sign that you might be doing something that's deleterious. That's my opinion on it anyway.
Right. That's a wonderful sort of landing. You ask one question and it goes off in all of those brilliant directions. And that is, there are two tangents. There are two questions that I'm just going to combine here. One that, builds off of what Dan just noted, about when cooperatives kind of veer off their values. So I have the honor of having been a member of the Hyde Park Food Cooperative, which at the time of its closing in around 2011 was about 75 years old. So the oldest cooperative institution in Chicago at the time, and it basically did just what Dan noted. It looked at this block of land that was about 7 blocks away from where it was, 55th Street store and a 47th Street store. And it said, we should go after that store, because if we don't, Jewel will get it, and then they will sell more food than us. And that one mistake, that big, massive lease that it had to digest and deal with, sunk the store. And so I am interested in the ways that if we talk about cooperatives and we talk about that principle 6 that Stacey has noted, being a really key aspect of our cooperative principles and a key differentiator, how do we relate as food cooperatives to the broader cooperative movement in the city of Chicago? Now, it's very thin in the city of Chicago at the moment, but it's rising. But how do we see ourselves as food cooperators relating to the broader cooperative movement? And I'm sure that we can invite maybe insight to Suzanne's question about cooperatives being community-owned enterprises that are radical in themselves. So I will go ahead and toss that question out into the panel.
I'd love to hear others' responses to that. I feel like that's something that needs to happen more. At least the co-ops that I am at, I get my ATM cash from the credit union there, but that's kind of the only really tangible connection that I feel to the greater cooperative movement. But others probably have much more to say on that.
Well, I'll throw a few things out there. I mean, I think there are a lot more cooperatives around than people usually realize, and I think part of Principle 6 is not so much a passive acceptance, like, oh, if a co-op approaches, we'll answer the call. I think it demands of us that we're a little more proactive in seeking out those relationships, because if those institutions are rooted in the same principles and values, then clearly preferring them as a partner should amplify our impact, and that's really what I think is of interest to people, that there's outcomes. So partnering with co-ops in general is an important piece of our culture. But with the food co-ops specifically, it's very clear that a lot of the, for example, supply chain management and the ability to incubate and develop small and medium enterprises, or help stabilize the local farming movement, is something that we can do much more effectively with the scale that we would offer collectively. I think there's a lot of things like that where when scale is important, combining forces makes a lot of sense where we have common ground. Sharing practices, staying in communication. So, oftentimes what one group experiences, the other is bound to at some point, almost certainly. I mean, this, we're all special and unique and all this, but in reality, the food co-ops have a great degree of coherence across the system. So if we're in communication, we have the wisdom of maybe 4 or 5, 6 or 7 institutions versus one, and that accelerates our learning and responsiveness. So I think being committed to keeping those communication channels not just open, but also active is an important thing. There may be other opportunities for things like you see the Austin Cooperative Business Association in Texas, for example. That's just one example where co-ops, Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance. I know one of the board members at Dill Pickle was instrumental with the development of that group. There may be ways to develop more robust institutions. I know we have a Chicagoland entity like that. I'm not sure it's particularly robust yet, but all of those things can be important because public policy is something we're unlikely to influence individually. And oftentimes that opens up access to capital, or, maybe grants, or maybe we can influence the development of a better composting or recycling system in the city. Now, there's so many things where I think we will have more voice and effect together, but a lot of it just comes from communication, dialogue, and having some coherent sense of overarching strategy where it makes more sense to do it together than alone.
Yeah, when I was working in Minneapolis doing marketing, there was every couple months meeting of all the marketers from all the co-ops there, a lot of them. And it was really hard to do stuff together because, we're all just sort of heads down doing our own thing, and it doesn't seem to be any extra time to do these broader things. But if we prioritize them, I think they can really have huge effects. And just that's built in as part of what we do as the cooperatives, instead of being an extras, and also how you represent yourself to the whole rest of the world as a movement. And you can go broader than co-ops too. Stacey talked about the solidarity economy. There's other organizations that aren't co-ops that are in some ways also community driven that maybe that you partner with. And then it occurs to me too that this socializing on a member and board member level is probably an awesome thing, just to mingle and share ideas and feel like a community. That it all doesn't have to go through the business side of things. It could, just go through the personal side of things. Because it's based on community. It's not, doesn't create community. It can create community too, but you need to have a community for it to be based on.
Again, I can only pose questions because you're the experts, but it seems when I mentioned Principle 6, I was really trying to think about the most ambitious kind of possibility, and fully recognizing that each entity, each business is really focused on its day to day. But what would it mean to have a really coherent, I mean, one thing I was struck about in the movie, in the film, was the plethora of cooperatives, right? And the kind of almost the interchange. It was almost, I know this is the wrong language, but I'm using it intentionally, almost like a conglomerate, a cooperative conglomerate in which there were all of these other small co-ops, right? And this under a rubric. And that just made me think like, wow, what would it look like in Chicago to ensure that, every community or every, whatever the right parameters are, whatever the right geography, has a co-op, and you can, surely it's a straightforward, in some ways, mathematical and geospatial question, because which supermarkets already exist. It's what Mariano's does, right? It's what Jewel does. And, but I mean, at a very small scale. But if the point was to have cooperatives in communities and have communities own the cooperatives, right? Well, the fact that there's a dearth of cooperatives in different sections of the city, we understand why, right? The race and class of those areas. But what would it look like? I mean, can we even imagine that possibility of that being a kind of a vision in terms of, well, every number of, I don't know what the geography is, but there should be co-ops, more co-ops. And it should be the responsibility of the co-op movement to ensure that they're happening. Marjagan did something similar, right? It wasn't just co-op food co-ops, but they incubated other co-ops, even if they were seen as competing with each other. But that it made sense because that's the public awareness. Co-ops become the culture, and I think when I think about the food industry and the growth of urban farming in Chicago and all of the policy, the urban farm policy, I forgot what the organization is, there's a lot of linked components. And I just am looking for more of the cohesion, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Mondragon, the system that exists in the Basque region of Spain is like this, really internationally known model of having a sort of connected economy that's like a huge percentage of the local economy and some of the national economy of different types of enterprises. And that, that's a very specific set of circumstances that brought that about. But I don't think it's a great thing to point at. And the other place is Emilia Romagna in Italy. And I believe that's a place where I think, is it 3% of profits of all co-ops go into a central fund for more cooperative development? We don't have anything like that. We have National Cooperative Grocers, which is a co-op of the food co-ops, and they do a bunch of stuff to serve all the co-ops. But I don't think there is sort of an organization or that has that sort of vision of like, let's grow this whole economy on a macro scale and think of ourselves as a big conglomerate that needs to permeate. And I would love that. Craig Cox in our film, he talked about that back in the 70s and early 80s in Minneapolis, you could be a counterculture person and like sort of like live within co-ops. You eat at the food co-op, you get your car repaired at the car repair co-op, you send your kid to a daycare co-op. There's a co-op hardware store, and that was sort of their dream of like being able to sort of live inside this cooperative system. And it's super ambitious, but like what a vision to draw people in and something to shoot for. And I think in some level it can't come from management because they got so much else to do, and some of them have the vision for it. But it has to come from the membership. Like, this is the priority for us, and how are we going to make this happen and have it happen that, because it has to be from a groundswell, from the grassroots.
All right, and I'm going to leap in here for a moment and just note that I didn't read the rest of Suzanne's comment, and I want to make sure that that's on the recording. But Suzanne noted, I believe most people have no idea what a co-op really is and need to see what democracy in action looks like. And that's certainly what we are. I'm gonna I'm coming up to Dana's question, and I'm gonna hold that for a moment, because I want to invite the folks who are in the chat to vision together for a moment about what would you like to see for the sort of co-op ecosystem and the co-op legacy in Chicago? What would it mean? What would it look like if what Stacey spoke about, there was this web and there was this ways that the food cooperatives related to all of these different ways that we are building a more just economy, building a more just world. So feel free to go ahead and fill that in the chat. If you are having trouble with the chat, feel free to type stack, S-T-A-C-K, and I'm happy to kind of make sure that you come off mute and say your comment. But share your vision in the chat of what you would like to see for the co-op ecosystem in Chicago. And I'm going to come up on Dana's question in a moment, but I saw you were about to unmute there, Dan, and share something maybe on that last prompt.
Well, just in terms of growth, I mean, there's multiple ways you could go about growth. I mean, when we mentioned the underground system, their grocery component is one company, and with many dozens of stores. That's also a worker consumer hybrid style or solidarity style co-op. So that's one way you can get infills. You've got a company that does multiple stores in the Twin Cities. Some of the companies do have more than one location. In Seattle, of course, we've got Puget Consumer Cooperative with about 15 locations. So that's one model. Another model is just proliferating all the independent co-ops. Of course, it really depends on the needs and cultural aspirations of individual community. So I don't like to fetishize tactics too much. I think this part of the beauty of a co-op is that we can select approaches that fit the needs of the people that are served. But if we certainly wanted to have growth, there could be just growth of individual co-ops to do some infill and reaching out into communities that are connected and culturally aligned, where you could have some support structures to help develop them. But I'm not so sure there's a one-size-fits-all approach there. And I think Chicago is a place with very distinctive neighborhoods in some cases, and I'm imagining that there's probably some combination of just the centralized growth and the proliferation of individual entities that would probably create the critical mass that we would be looking for. But in Italy, it's the same way. You've got various co-ops that operate on an individual basis, but Co-op Italia dominates North Italian scene, and their voting percentages are far higher than any food co-op here that I've ever seen. So it's not like that scale is necessarily anti-democratic. I think it's just a matter of merging your tactics and strategy in a way that suits the people that are served. But in any case, all those things are doable. The note about the 3%, just keep in mind a lot of those things are possible because of legislative action at the national level. And that's one of the things when we talked about Principle 6, where if we want to have access to those kinds of funding mechanisms, or even to be able to form something like a social co-op or whatnot, we need changes in the law. And we're more likely to get there when groups of communities of owners from various co-ops work in unison. And in an individual basis, it will just be the tilting at windmills, I think.
I like that comment about that there's not one model that has to be, and that sort of the ethics of all this means that we should let things develop as they need to be. But maybe one thing that's a challenge in either case is that you need to engage that community that you're going to serve. And in our film, that was certainly a tension with the Contemporary store opening up, and this sort of monolithic co-op going to drop a store into a neighborhood because it's what they need. And there was pushback, and thank goodness there was, because I think that's why the store is successful now. And they came up with agreements about how many, who's going to work there. And when you go into the stores, it is serving the community. But that, I think, in any model can be the big misstep. The idea of cooperatives, aiding cooperatives in the way things played out here in Minneapolis, this small cooperative that didn't succeed, got support from East Side, one other smaller cooperative, but it didn't get a lot of support from the big ones. From here, it's the Wedge and the Seward. Maybe things would have played out better if it, not just in funding, but mostly in sort of institutional knowledge. And that sort of support, I think, is vital. And that's what the small co-op that I was connected with suffered from a lack of.
And I just want to note that, when I was speaking about that vision, it was about independent co-ops with full understanding that it has to be endogenous, it has to come from community. But we're at a disadvantage when Black and Brown communities have less resource and less awareness of the model, right? And a myriad of other issues that wouldn't necessarily foster that kind of a certain type of agency, right? So those with resources can offer, that's what I mean. And there's the real issue that we also spoke about in terms of policy. So in Italy, the what was it, the Macora Act or whatever it is that created an enabling environment for some of that transference of money. I'm not saying this is the ideal way, but there are, and I really appreciate Bernardine's comments that, you know, with a sense of empathy and humility and understanding of the context in which we're working in the stark stratification of Chicago, the kind of, we could come up with other models that would have more equitable distribution and benefit. That's what I was trying to say. At the same time, honoring the autonomy principle as well.
And I'm going to lean over into the chat here and just read off a few of these visions before we kind of get to this. I think Dana is going to be our capstone question, and we'll connect that to the legacy. But there was a note here. I love the idea of every neighborhood in Chicago having their own co-op that meets their need, and then us being able to work together, like Erik was saying, to influence state policy, partner with urban farms from Victoria. And Dana noting, so actually this is connected to the question about curious about what folks on the call think about there being more co-ops in the city. So we'll get back to that in a moment. Also think that there are more housing co-ops in Chicago here than I realize. The Suzanne noting some small attempts to bring housing, worker, and food co-ops together a few years back related to the Chicago Community Loan Fund hosting an event. Time and resources are always at a premium in trying to hold those spaces together for a long time. Bernardine noting to have that type of cooperative structure here in Chicago will require empathy and humility. We as a city would benefit from a strong group of cooperatives standing together and consistently planting and growing startups. Knowledge is what Southside continues to seek. Dana noting, my vision is that there are more neighborhood co-ops too, and that they foster bringing different parts of our city together. There's still so much segregation in Chicago. I would hope that co-ops could bring communities across the city together, maybe not to become homogenous, but to connect and learn from each other. And then Suzanne noting another thing, I believe the state of Illinois laws, not great for co-ops. We did fix that on the worker co-op side somewhat. It's still to be seen how it pans out in implementation. And Bernadette noting, I see a vision of more co-ops across the city. It's one of the first things I mentioned in my new Zoom meeting yesterday. I'm a new member. Sorry, I did, you know, Bernadette did say that earlier, and I missed referencing that in the vision call outs. But I'll share something that I shared on a call, an interview with Jessica, one of our marketing team members at Dill Pickle, for a sort of board member interview on Instagram. But in terms of my thinking about the sort of co-op dearth in Chicago, I talked about there being a real challenge with actually sharing the passing on the history, or passing on both, you know, successes and mistakes in Chicago in terms of the cooperative ecosystem. So I can go to what happened to the Berkeley Food Co-op, and I can get, you know, this long history of the Berkeley co-op ecosystem, and, you know, all of the challenges that, you know, befell that space. I don't have that same type of history with the Hyde Park Food Co-op. You know, I didn't necessarily know I was a member of a food co-op. That's a whole nother story about their sort of owner linkage committee, which you should join at Dill Pickle. But there is not necessarily a way that when these mistakes occur and when this history happens, that it's being handed on. And this is actually what drew me into the Dill Pickle. I was working with the Healthy Food Hub. We had a food buying club operating in the South Side in Avalon Park and Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. And we wanted to transform into a cooperative, but we were already 5 years into our operation, and trying to make that pivot with no resources, no connections, no support structure in the city was impossible, basically. And so I was attracted to the board service because I wanted to actually get some of the inner workings of this operation that I could then bring back to my community on the South Side, and, you know, and foster some more of that cooperation. So, you know, that's actually what draws me into board service. And you know, I hope that that this is an opportunity for us to think about how those resources and how that knowledge is being shared. So I want to then revisit now Dana's question about other folks' thoughts on why there aren't more co-ops in Chicago. And then if you want to tie that into a closing question about what you see as the what you would like to see as the cooperative legacy in Chicago. And certainly I'll extend, for Deacon and Erik, if you don't necessarily want to reflect on Chicago, your thoughts about the cooperative legacy in general. And I'll give a moment for folks to reflect on those two very large questions as we begin to wind down. You're muted, Erik.
Obviously, I'm not as familiar with the Chicago situation, but that's most cities' situation is not being full of co-ops, and the few places that are, like the Twin Cities or Seattle and Portland, certain, that goes back way before in the 60s as they're getting going with cooperatives coming out of the cultures that the people who immigrated there are from and such. So it's not surprising, and getting something going, it's hard, and it's not going to be easy. Craig Cox also said when we interviewed him that the original vision, the hippie vision of the co-ops was one in every neighborhood, like 50 tiny stores, and that sounds cool, but it's not economically viable. But where was it going with that? Oh, just so you can give yourself a break. That's not something wrong with Chicago. It's the typical situation, and sometimes there are fallow periods, and then there's this incredible growth, and you can't really predict it. And no one saw this co-op surge coming in the 70s before it happened. So there's huge potential, and for the broader co-op movement, my vision would be that we find some way of engaging members in new ways. Now that initially the members were volunteering in the stores and doing a lot of work, and thus they knew each other. And the co-op I first started working at was still in that model, and it took me a long time to go grocery shopping because I was just talking to people the whole time. It was so social, and that was cool. It also was inefficient in lots of ways, and sometimes violated labor law. And it's not a situation where we have a lot of people who can work for nothing or very low wages like they were doing in the 70s, or they have time to volunteer. So that model of member engagement is not really viable. But I think there's, millions of people who are members of co-ops, and they're really not asked to do anything besides shop, and they have no way of meeting each other and working together and cooperating literally. And something I'd love to be a part of is finding ways for people to work together to build the whole system, and use some of that huge potential energy of all these people who have this commitment in a better way to make something huge happen.
Well, it's a tough one, to say exactly why. I mean, without some parallel universe experiment or something, who knows what the exact cause is. But I think the point that you just made, that the exception is the cities that have an abundance of food cooperative locations. That's, you look at New York City, and I know Park Slope was mentioned earlier, but really, that is, as large as that city is, there's two notable food co-ops that I know about, and that's a massive city. Where's the Miami Food Co-op? I don't know. I don't know that there is one. So I think there's when you look at where food co-ops have formed, other than a couple of exceptions, they primarily are in college towns with more affordable real estate and less, especially during the formative periods for those co-ops, there were less competitive environments for natural foods. And so I think there's capital is really the ultimate barrier. I would also say that we do actually have quite a few food co-ops in Chicago. It's just only one of them has a store. So we're trying, but I think as we figure out how to handle the recruitment of the capital necessary and get these open, we'll really see where we are. But I think that's the reason I think that there aren't more now is the difficulty in finding a site that's affordable and viable and to attract the capital needed. You know, there's the grocery is such a much more competitive industry. You couldn't, just like you say, the 50 small co-ops is a little inefficient co-ops that, you know, don't have any real way to handle labor and inventory effectively. They're never going to be able to provide the service level needed to be viable, even from people who are aligned. People still have lives to live, and they need us to provide value. So I think the biggest thing is that we need to have better access to capital, and hopefully some of the changes that are going on in Washington, D.C. will help us with that. But that's, I think, the actual $1 million question.
Yeah, it is the $1 million question. And so I am going to offer an idea that you see my path here. I keep offering these ideas that are actually perhaps not plausible, but something Dan just said struck me in terms of like New York having 2 food co-ops of note. I think they're far more, as you say, they don't all have brick and mortar, and some do, and they're very small. And the ones I'm thinking of only provide and I don't know if this was intentional, but they only provide a kind of a limited kind of array of product, right? And, you know, is that a model? I know we're talking about the 50 small co-ops is inefficient by any kind of business model. It would be, except when you start talking about the specialization and this kind of agglomeration by specialization, in which it becomes super efficient to have co-ops strategically placed, any enterprise strategically placed, and they specialize in something. I have no idea the feasibility of that, but just this conversation, at least just made me think, that might be something to look at. But it's also, in terms of my vision for Chicago, it is building the infrastructure a bit more. And I'm in conversation with Mike often, and while there are a lot of things happening, I think the cohesion is where we need to do more work. And I know we're trying, and I know there are different formations that are trying to do that. It's not just around food co-ops, but the cooperative ethos, the solidarity economy, culture. And by building that and strengthening that and proliferating that, I think that creates space, right? And there are funding mechanisms. I know funding is a constraint, but there are little buckets of money if we could actually create the cohesion that I think we need. But it's my thought.
I guess the piece I would add is just the importance of getting people in the door and how that happens. The Hampton Co-op was the last one in the Twin Cities that required that you had to volunteer, which they realized was somewhat of a barrier, as Erik mentioned. When changes happen, there can be tension from the people that really have this locked idea of what the co-op needs to be. When the Wedge, one of the big ones in the Twin Cities, renovated, got fancier and added a meat department, people broke in and splattered paint on the floor. There was outrage at that idea that there would have meat in the co-op. But who are you excluding if you're not going to serve, what's the point of not having meat? If you want a vegetarian world, well, you can advocate for that in ways other than keeping people from coming into your store. Bring them into the store, and maybe then you can little by little get them more interested in the produce section. But the importance, again, of just serving knowing what your community wants and serving them at the same time as you're trying to nudge them towards other possibilities, which is a huge possibility. And it's so exciting to hear about all these co-ops in Chicago that are springing up. It's like, this is what happened in the 70s in Minneapolis seems to be happening now in Chicago, which is pretty exciting.
All right, and here we are landing this conversation. There's so much to talk about. There's never enough time to kind of get all of the things in that we want to get in. But this has been an exciting conversation with the film team, Erik and Deacon. Wonderful conversation with Dan Arnett, Chicago Market, Stacey Sutton of the UIC, and the Solidarity ecosystem in Chicago. And this is where we are. We have our dill pickle, our sugar beet, our common ground, our Chicago Market, our South Side, our Prairie Food, our Austin Food, also forming, and Wild Onion Market also forming, right? So these are all of the things that are happening in Chicago, and wherever you are cooperating from. Small plug, get involved with your owner linkage team or your owner engagement team. Chicago Market has just brought on some new board members, and there's certainly opportunities to get involved there. There are always opportunities to get involved with dill pickle. I'm sure that sugar beet has lots of ways to get involved. And yes, we're looking for more board members at the dill pickle. So other cooperators, if you've got things going on that you want to pepper into the chat, now is the time as we close out this conversation. We'll have this recording up, possibly on the Dill Pickle YouTube channel. So look out for that. And I want to really thank our panelists this evening for dropping in, for having this exchange with each other. I think you've done a valuable service to the cooperators in Chicago, and I really appreciate the film team for bringing this film to us, for sharing with us this history of the co-op wars, and for allowing all of these cooperators. I want to say, were we up to 80 streams?
Yeah, I think it's more than that now. Yeah.
Okay, so we're up there in the streams. Lots of people dropped into the film screening, the show and tell, and so there are certainly more opportunities for us to come together as cooperators in Chicago and continue doing more of these events. Thank you all.
Thank you, and I want to thank you, Mike, and Victoria and David at Dill Pickle for contacting us and putting this together. This is our first event of this sort in this distribution period, and it's been awesome, and we're so grateful to be part of something super exciting happening in Chicago.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. This is great.
Okay. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Yeah. Night.
Oh boy. Good.